Yeah. So we're talking about, but before we started recording, we were talking about basically leisure time. And if we, for those who are just doing research on for funsies on the side, do you go back to school for the PhD? I
Mm,
think I think we were talking about off record, so I figured we just jump in on that.
yeah,
Um, you want to
yeah,
jump in, Javier, when you're
yeah,
thinking
yeah,
about that?
yeah. Do you jump back in for the PhD? I guess to make clear, if you jump in back for the PhD, it's like it's not for like anything else, right? Like it's not for um, you know, for like maybe like clout or anything, it's just like it's more like just to do it, just to I mean, I guess my curiosity is um the freedom to do it, really. Like the freedom to do it without saying or having to say, um, this is gonna be my career or something like that. Because I think a lot of what prevents you from pursuing, accomplishing things that you would be curious about or interest like I would be curious about how a PhD program would go for me. Obviously, there would be a lot of tensions because American PhD philosophy generally is more, it's not continental. It's actually ironically more analytical.
Yeah.
Um, you'd have to go to where like maybe Aaron is, if you want to get maybe even continental. Uh, but for the most part, because this is something that my U of A teacher professor told me, she goes, well, if you pursue a PhD in philosophy at U of A, I have to tell you, you're going to be disappointed in the sense of there's not much continental philosophy being done there. Um, there's only analytical. But this still interests me because basically you get to ride in that tension of why is analytical still important in the philosophy department uh, in America? Why is the analytic philosophy still a thing to talk about? Um, and so that would be a kind of fun experience, but then also would help develop and understand the other side. I think that's what strikes my curiosity for, but I also feel like the thing that would deter me is like I feel like I'd be reading a lot of boring shit. Um, that's also what would deter me. But yeah, go ahead, Joaquin.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that because I know because actually I got curious because I'm teaching at the Mount St. Mary, and I noticed that to even take like to go into the major of philosophy here at Mount St. Mary, you have to take logic.
Yeah,
Like it's the one class you must. It's you know what I mean. It's very similar to in my discipline design. You must take typography. There's like this core fundamental kernel on which the entire discipline is based on is this, and that decision to say logic is it. Logic is that kernel. Is very similar to in design saying typography is that kernel. So it's the kernel origin for the entire account or training in that school. So I think that's actually not. I'm not that surprised that your professor told you that. Um, which for individuals like ourselves, because I talked to you off the record about, even though in design our terminal degrees at master's levels, MFA, but because I have such interest in philosophy, I was like, you know what, for funsy, what if I go for the PhD? Just for me, it would be almost. It's almost for me, it would be because my interest is in the beautiful and my account and reading of Plato and Aristotle is so antithetical to the traditional stance of what Plato and Aristotle is saying. That's really interesting because that would mean if I pulled through a PhD on that with that stake and went through the PhD program and got through the committee with it, then that's traditional the stance of real rigor. You have a controversial stance that's unorthodox, and it went through review of people who know. So they would absolutely challenge me on my description of the human being, the principle of human being desirable news and use desiring. Why not just say proasis? Because that'd be an example where the reading of that is to say, well, why are you breaking it down into desirable news and news desiring when you could just say proasis choice?
Okay.
You see, like that now be a classical Greek. I remember it was one Discord group where there was an individual who did have Platonic Aristotelian research background, and he did challenge me on that point. And we went through the Greek. We went toe to toe on the Greek, reading through that. That's an example. So for me, it's like almost like the contest of someone who knows, who challenges me on this account versus just doing stuff and just putting it out there. And then quite frankly, people trusting me with my take as that I know Plato, Aristotle. Now I love them, and I have a great love affair with them, and I'm very intimate with their texts. So there's that, but there is a difference in terms of having that intimacy with it and actually being put to the test of your citations, your reasoning, your translations, your account. Are those legitimate in terms of a read? Now, one can argue, well, that's just people's interpretations. Well, yes, but that's the point, is that you have to have that discourse space of talking through what is the principle of man. Is it choice, proasis, or is it, but then why did Aristotle also include desirable news and news desiring then? Why is it there? There's a argumentation being made about that. That's one example. I'm just thinking through that. So that's the point. So like for me, the discussion of going for the PhD will be almost a space of rigor to find out if this take I'm having is a reasonable, is actually a legitimate take. But one can make an argument, why do you got to do that? Right? I think in one sense, it's almost like, and that's the thing, I wish that the online space, the power academic space, had more of that opportunity, but it doesn't really exist. Because what tends to happen is, like, for example, I teach courses. People are generally taking courses because they're already bought in to the basic premise of what the course is talking about. No one's going into Plato course, like my virtue courses or beauty courses, and saying, you know what? No, I'm against beauty, or I'm against virtue. And now this course, I'm going to challenge this account based on this. So you don't get I think the question of, there's an assumption of, are we just in our little yap bubbles, just talking to ourselves and just full of self-agreement? Or what about the space of contention to work through in the context of discussion to find the understanding of what's happening here? Because that's traditional dialectics. Like, that's actually not the Hegelian mode of it, but that's traditional mode. It's supposed to be counterclaims, and then talking through the tensions of the understanding of what's happening here, of our terms and how we're using them together, which is very different even from just demonstrational mode. Because also that's the issue. Traditionally, demonstrational mode, especially statistics. The problem with statistics is you already have to pre-presume the legitimacy of the claims being made in statistics. Otherwise, you'll find some justification to dismiss it. That's the problem. I've always found the problem with statistical reasoning is that it's very powerful and very important, but it's so easy to dismiss it if you don't buy the premises of the statistical analysis. You'll just make some claim. You didn't consider this time frame. You didn't consider this variable. You didn't consider this, right? And then that disqualifies the imposition of the claim being made by the statistical reasoning, versus philosophical discourse, where your argumentations around the interpretation and structuring of reasoning of texts and how they map on together. Like this example of when Aristotle says, what's the principle of man, versus his definition as, is it choice? Is it desirable news desiring? Or is it three? And what is the relationship with that? Javier.
Yeah, I mean, making me think, like, there's a couple of discrepancies that we have. Like, one, we have this discrepancy of people don't know how to enter into the discourse. So, meaning that there's a sense in which, let's put it this way, there's a sense in which there seems to be this idea that everything is interpretation, which is true. But then there's another end where it's like, okay, I'm getting at the truth of the matter. But then there's this middle course where people are struggling to even be like, they don't even want to articulate anything, because they don't, they're not confident enough to make an interpretation. So that's what I think is interesting, because like in the academic discourse, you could almost say, or in the specialized field discourse, we're very confident in making the interpretation so we can have that interaction that we're having, right? To have this competent back and forth between the Greek, what's being said in the Greek, and you could almost say those dialogues are fruitful because it demonstrates like, okay, my interpretation isn't obvious, right? We're fighting over the same lines of thought, or we're disagreeing over the same lines of thought within the text itself. And so we're going back and forth. So something fruitful can possibly happen through that dialogue. The issue that I see trying to go in is, how does somebody from the outside enter into it, right? And how should they think about entering into it? Because this is something that Adam Phillips talks about in his book. When you're a beginner in psychoanalysis, and I think this could apply to anything. When you're a beginner in anything, you have to opt for the prescription of the essence of what psychoanalysis is, because you're just entering into it. Someone has to tell you what it is. Someone has to tell you what it's about. So you enter into it with someone telling you what psychoanalysis is. The real interesting thing would be, how does someone enter into something, gather their own interpretation, and then introduce that as a new competitive model for understanding a thinker. Because I think a lot of people from the outside of academia are afraid of being the one to introduce a competitive model of how you should read XY thinker. And that I always find an interesting tension, because or this way, a lot of people think like, I think like Zizek is a very interesting example, because, and then you're also an interesting example too, Joachim, because your reading, it would be Aristotelian, but it's not purely Aristotelian, because there is Plato in there. So it's that those two combinations alone that sort of feed this reading of Aristotle and Plato, Aristotle back into Plato, Plato into Aristotle, back and forth, that you come up with these interesting readings that have justifications in themselves, that prove to be really worthy of considering. And I think that's the same thing with Zizek. Like, what made Zizek is the fact that he can read Hegel into Lacan, and then he can read Lacan into Hegel. And so because he has this mode, it's like, is Zizek, when we ask this question, is Zizek really getting at, does Zizek really have, quote, the correct interpretation of Hegel? It's like, well, he has justification. He has justification. But do we ever, I guess the question is, do we ever read someone without additional thinkers that we are throwing in there. And I feel like it's almost like when you have a different thinker that you have as a tool to read another thinker with, it's almost as if you're reading it as if you're translating. Because I believe the tension that you gave me as an example of the guy that you're competing with Greek definitions with is that he's strictly a Neoplatonist thinker. And so he's reading Neoplatonism into the Aristotelian text, and then he's competing with you about these specific Greek ideas. But what I'm trying to say is when we have this set of tools or set of language, like for example, I had confessed to you earlier this week that it's hard for me not to read Hegel now in a kind of Rortian way. Like I can almost read Hegel in a Rortian way, and I have no problem. But if I didn't have Rorty, maybe I would still have more problems than I would before. It's interesting, this act of reading, but yeah.
Well, to build on that, one is the onboarding problem of how to bring in new people into the discourse space. This has been a problem I've been thinking about a lot about, because I have to train undergrads to get into design discourse, for example, and design training. So that's a problem I'm very alive with. I think your example, as you pointed out, which this is why I appreciate it, because I didn't even see it that way, but you're totally correct that what I'm doing is I'm Plato with Aristotle, and I'm reading into Aristotle with Plato. That's absolute modality. And that's very true. I didn't even see Zizek in that mode of Lacan into Hegel, Hegel into Lacan. I think it's actually very true. And so that kind of modality of multiple accounts reading into each other, right? And then generating a new insight from that interplay of the two. I know at the higher levels of training, that's what we ideally wish for, is that we develop understanding of accounts, and then we pair that with other accounts, and then a generation of a new insight coming from the interplay of the two. That language of how might we consider, for example, the live example I used in the Parallax course I just taught recently was very famously from Parmenides, the argument of participation of the forms fails. And then I quote the line from Parmenides, who he says, this mode of participation fails. It will have to be by some other mode. But yet we know that everything has an essence, that it participates. Like he says, we affirm this does exist and it must exist. Otherwise we're doomed. This whole project fails of philosophy of intelligibility. So he said it must be true in some way, but not by the ways we're talking through together. And then I come in with my Aristotelian reading and go, well, clearly, because there's no anageia. That's Aristotle. That's how you answer this question. Participation by activity of any endomasses. So endomasses exist, and thus that's a mapping extension. Aristotle gives an extension and gives reasons for that extension. And now with that understanding, you read back Plato and you come to see a new understanding of what Plato's doing. That's an example.
Yeah.
But see that requires you have to have knowledge. You have to have both in your reading of Plato. You had to have that built up knowledge, background knowledge of Aristotle. And it has to be a living, it has to be an intimacy. Like it has to be that kind of thing where literally you're just hanging out and you just recall, oh, right, this was said by Alcibiades. This was in the course. That's basically what I'm doing in my courses. I'm like, okay, there's a concept or a term being used. Where have I heard that term used? Oh, right, it was in Parmenides, right? Oh, this was used in Phaedrus. Oh, this was used in Symposium. And then you go in and do the mappings, right? And then, all right, Aristotle talked about this somewhere else. Where Aristotle talked about liberality, where Plato talked about liberality, right? And then you look and see in terms of their relationships. That requires a certain kind of intimacy on the fly thinking, which clearly, I'll tell you right from an educational point of view, you're not doing that. We're at recall. We're like, here's the concept, give me back the concept. I want to make sure you understand it by recalling it back to me. That is absolutely not the mode of free play. That's what we're talking about. We're free play of concepts and models. And that's the tension, is that But to get that, you have to be literally have to be initiated into accounts. So I'm thinking like almost like I'm thinking Daniel's note of the girdle point. You have to be really intimate with a model, with a whole system of account.
Yeah.
But then go to the limit of it, know its limit, and then go, how might I interpret this with other accounts? Because by the way, that happens all the time. But the thing is, we don't realize we're doing it. AKA Plato, Aristotle. Oh, you read Plato say, oh, he just wants to fuck everybody. He just wants to fuck young boys, right? That's what Eros is. Having sex with young boys. Okay, not really, but that's our modern hermeneutic suspicion presentation. Or in the case of Aristotle, he's a sexist. So dismiss instantly what he's saying because of it. You see, that is an example of people are doing it, but they're doing it out of instinct of their current, basically nomos, right? Their current habitual nomos in which they're activating in, and they go, these texts don't matter because they're unintelligible to us. Or it'll be the quick off the cuff read about it, and then you dismiss it because that's the interpretation that stands. So I think that's part of the education is not only that, how do we get them integrated into the conversation, but then the tension of the emphasis of recall training versus participational play in concepts. Like that's a much higher level of thought. That one can make an argument that that's not even necessarily the case in grad school. It takes you all the way to the PhD level to get to that level of thought and interactive in operation. That's part that has a lot of tension in my mind.
Yeah, no, you're raising some really good points because when I did my religious studies bachelor's, one of the things that I loved was I think the most fun that I had was ironically in my religious studies intro course. Because with that, I wish there was like more courses like it. I did have another course like it was called a spirituality and psychology course. That was also a very fun one. But what we did in the intro to religious studies course was we had to read a plurality of accounts about religion, about people claiming what religion was. And then we had to write comparative essays about competing models. And then we had to do this one time we had to do this move where we had to combine them together. How do we enrich? How can one model inform another model? Of course, the one issue with that course that ends up kind of being problematic is that, ironically, a lot of people were very dismissive of Freud in my religious studies course. And what that meant was if you weren't really, I don't know how to put this, intimate with the model, because I feel like, in my opinion, I don't think anybody that's intimate with the Freudian model actually says what they say about Freud from a stereotypical point of view. They have critiques, but they don't say what we generally hear about Freud. Like saying that, you hear comments like, oh, well, Freud gave cocaine to his patients. That's wrong. It's like, well, Freud also thought that, he had a reason for it, but he also didn't think it was essentially a great thing, but he thought for this particular case, it might be helpful. He ends up realizing that he made a mistake and he stopped doing it. But anyways, people like to bring up examples like this to kind of prove that, Freud was a bad clinician. But again, the point is, and maybe this is the point, right? Because some people see the point as I'm already intimate with the account and I'm not interested in furthering my account. So that's a tension. right? You know, you see this with Heidegger, you see this with a lot of postmodern thinkers, Foucault, Deleuze. But the point is, and maybe this will be the interesting part to explore, is the point to then read a thinker into another thinker, another model, as we've been saying, and then what we can gather from it. Because I do imagine that if all our conversations are, and it's almost kind of impossible to do, because even as I'm going through this program that seems separate, completely separate from philosophy, it ironically has enriched my account of Aristotle. And I can give an example of this so people can understand what I'm talking about. So when Aristotle talks about in the Nicomachean Ethics about ergon, translated as function, a lot of people read this, and it's because I've read a critique about this on Substack, where it's like, the people look at the function argument as a very weak argument. But actually, from a physical therapy assistant point of view, when people hear function, they think, and this is something that even the field had suffered from historically, before we started having to think about disability and everything, the exact counter argument was, okay, well, Aristotle's not thinking about things that don't function. What if they don't function the way that they should, right? What's interesting about this is that what you learn in physical therapy is when people suffer an impairment, we presume function means going back to the functional norm. That's what we presume. But that's predicated on whether, and this is again going to use Aristotle's kind of concepts, whether you have the capacity to go back to the original way that you were, right? But if you suffer from a, lost limb, well, your function has completely changed. You cannot, but here's the thing. You have a new functional norm. And that is the whole point. The whole point is to discover what your new functional norm is, and actually like, for example, you need, this is going to be interesting for people, you need 100 degrees total of turning your arm like this and turning your arm like this to read a newspaper. Okay? You need 130 degrees to lift your shoulder like this to be able to comb your hair. So when people talk about returning to function, what we call these activities of daily living, these are our goals. You don't need the full 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. You don't need it, actually. But you might need it, or you might need it if you're somebody that specifically does activities that do these things. But if you're talking about, I just need it to do my hair, then you don't need the 180 degrees. So it's the fact that we have a body that has the capacity to do certain full ranges of motion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that having full range of motion isn't functional. Or let me phrase it the other way. I said it the wrong way. To be functional, you don't need full range of motion. That's what people don't understand. And so when we read back into Aristotle, to be functional does not mean that you have to meet the standard norms of what people perceive as functionality.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually very specific, and this is what I like about my field. It's actually very specific to the individual. What do they want? Do you want to get back to sports? Because then now we're talking about a different kind of functionality. We're talking about high stress activities, I need to prepare your body for that high stress. We need to think about the ways that we can prepare your body for that high stress. But if you're just an individual that wants to get back to walking, well then, okay, we need to get back that 60 degrees of knee flexion, because that's exactly what you need for walking. But you also need 90 to sit. Do you want to sit? Yes. So you're going to need 90 degrees of hip flexion. So this is how a field has interpenetrated my reading of Aristotle. You go ahead.
Yeah, I cool. No, just because actually that's another thing too, is that absolutely my readings of Plato and Aristotle were absolutely informed by my practice as a designer. So I'm not that surprised by your point.
Yeah.
On that issue, on your example about activity, work, and the body, even the word for organ, an instrument, is interchangeable in Greek as an example. Like it's of the organ is the instrument of work. So when the organ is damaged or not there, then it changes the work because it's not there. So yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. I think that reads very nicely. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is, yeah, the activity of work is dependent on, there's an idea of intention behind it. So basically that body under work is very different when it's an athlete versus walking. And actually a very big one I know from my father, for example, is where also personal history comes involved with this, is sitting down and standing up, getting up from sitting. That's actually a major indicator of your condition of your body. If you can't get up from sitting, that's actually a very quick heuristic of the condition of the body, related to operations of work. Now, what's interesting about the human being is also, because you're talking about things like reading a newspaper, combing your hair, so common work. There's also the operation of condition of the organs related to intellectual activity.
Yes.
Right, because idea of memory. That's actually a very big one, right? So memory, attention, focus, which have interesting overlaps, because sometimes those are environmental and sometimes those are psychological, right? In terms of mental health issues, you get anxiety, right? That's very hard to focus when you're under anxiety.
Yeah.
As an example. So that gets really interesting in terms of the activity, work, interacting with function, right? And conditions. I think that's really interesting. So that's some points. Like this is an example of drawing personal experience, but also from your disciplines that are outside philosophy, and then reading back into it with it. They give a new coloring or description about it. I think that really catches my attention. I think a big note is the issue of usually, like, typically people are not going to bother with this mode of inquiry if they think the accounts given to them get the job done. Like, why we got to talk about this when this problem got solved?
Right.
I actually catch that language a lot. If you think if an issue has been solved, then there's no need to think about it anymore because it's been solved. But typically, usually what happens is and that's actually, I think aberring here is that, and that's usually a general philosophical inquiry. There's a problem. There's some kind of conflict, tension, or issue at hand that the current account is failing at. And that's why we're doing this inquiry, because there's something going on. Now, sometimes it's about, okay, there's this circumstance, we got some positives out of it, but there's a net negative. There's a side effect that is not desirable. How might we get this positive effect without the side effect? This is very medical, right? Clinical medicine works that way. Like first generational drugs typically are effective, but they usually may have a very negative side effect that is counter effect, like either completely negates the benefit or really weighs out the cost benefit analysis of using it. So I think of it that way a lot of times, almost from a clinical medicine point of view. Other aspects of, I think also another basic point for me in the arts, like why did I get involved in philosophical inquiry, even though I come from a design context and training, is quite frankly, I was bored. Like, we're just stuck with we're asking the same questions, we're making the same work. I don't see any live work happening here. So it means that our thinking is wrong. There's something going on here where we've exhausted the account. There's nothing else live at play. We're just reproducing the same things over and over again. So I think those are also things I'm thinking about. And the problem with students is, can I just pass the test? There's that issue. Number two, can I just get the simple account that'll get my job done? Because they're thinking within the social context of, quite frankly, getting a job. Like this has helped me get my job and fill my job needs. Yes. Thank you very much. I'll move on with my life. And by the way, hey, listen, I'm very sympathetic. How much statistical analysis do I need? I need some. How much statistical reason do I need? I need some. Do I need to go into quite frankly, the problem of probability and Bayesian probability versus frequentist probability? And what is the ontological implication functions of that? Yeah, at the level of thought I'm going through now. But as an undergrad or someone even just in professional practice, you probably don't need to worry about that now, do you? As an example. So these are the kind of tension parts I'm thinking in terms of the onboarding problem of people want fixed is recall issues, just getting enough of a job of account to get the job done. Thus, that actually turns the work. I don't need the full thing. I just need enough to get the job done, the activity work done for this account or a circumstance in my life, versus the people who enter the limit case and go, there's a contradiction. There's a tension, a clinical tension, almost a clinical tension of we're operating on this account and this way of working, and there are consequences that are not, there are side effects that are not good, right? They're less ideal. They're not either by intention or qualification, not good. How might we get these positives without these negatives? Or quite frankly, boredom. Like, okay, I'm just bored of this discourse space and working space. What else can we do? What else? Almost like this, what else can we do with this? But that's much more self-internal motivation and almost almost symptomic kind of drive at that point. I give it to you.
Yeah, you made me think that when it's almost like when people already have a made understanding of an account, they're not really committed to that account, which is going to sound counterintuitive, because the way I interpret being committed to the account is here's the symptom, right? When people discover that account is incorrect, they usually leave, right? So you'll hear stories like, I used to be a Freudian and now I'm a Jungian, or vice versa. But I do think it does require, and there's still problems with this position, but it does require one to be committed to an account. Because if you're not committed to an account and you're just going to go from account to account to account, trying to find what you think is the truth, because I think this is the thing. When we're committed to an account, it's because we believe it's right. We're no longer committed to account if we believe it's wrong or if we believe it's incorrect. And this is why I think religion is interesting, because there's a sense in which philosophical inquiry can kind of shift and bounce and jump if it wants to. But there's also a sense in which if you're a committed Hegelian or committed Freudian, then you are constantly having your, to use Daniel's terms, your map tested, right? It's tested against all the counter factuals, is tested against all the counter evidence, is tested against all these counter arguments. But I think the point is that if you stick to an account long enough, you start to see that it isn't everything, but then also you still stick with it because you find yourself being able to read other accounts into it, or Freud into Aristotle, or vice versa. And then so now it's almost even difficult to call yourself a Freudian, because now you've gained the capacity to read other accounts into it. and in some sense, it's not even like really quote Freudian anymore, because it's not this pure Freud. And I think the whole point is maybe we don't want a pure anything. What we want is, what are the different ways that Freud could be described that could actually be interesting to me, and maybe even more beneficial than the previous readings that we've given thus far. Because again, what's the problem we have with classical thinkers? The problem that we have with classical thinkers is this idea of, okay, those are previous accounts. Those previous accounts are wrong. It's like, okay, well, that presumes that all the presumptions that philosophy has built up to have completely negated those accounts. Or it presumes that Aristotle can only be read one way. And that way was, function is a bad argument because X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, that's if you read it this way. If you, now that we have physical therapy, it's like, well, that gives a whole elucidation to work, a whole elucidation to health and function. What we mean by function is completely different from, this is just what it does. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, and the danger is, okay, so one danger is what Daniel talks about with a commitment to a map or commitment to a model the model can always be expanded, right? So it's endless, infinity, and so on. But I think once you realize this one specific point, that actually no model is alone, and Luber would like this point where it's like every system is connected to every other system. Once you understand that point, then what we have is an infinite variety of richness in which we could read something. And I think for me, the task wouldn't be, I guess it depends what your goal is. But for me, I think if I were to pose like where I find your work interesting, Jockin, is like, if someone were to say to me, and I've received these compliments myself, right? But I know it's because of you, right? Where someone had messaged me, right? I think I shared it with you, where someone messaged me personally on Substack, and they're like, I've always had a distaste for Aristotle, right? And they said, but the way you read Aristotle regained my interest because I didn't know I could read him this way, right? And so the beauty model, the whole beauty conversation to me is also kind of on a bigger scale exactly that kind of thing of just like, we thought beauty was done with. We thought beauty, we kind of knew what beauty was. It's just an aesthetic. It's just XYZ. But now it has real moral, ethical side to it, other than what previously people had talked about it aesthetically, right? Beauty standards, how people look. But yeah.
I think actually one note in terms of the training in the arts, which only how we're trained in our voice to get our unique voice in the arts, is a training of studying masters, studying tradition, and is your unique interpretation of synthesis of the tradition that creates your unique voice. Mm-hmm. So I think actually it's a very similar parallel, meaning my philosophical takes is this interplay of Plato, Aristotle with some Al-Ghazali and Aquinas and Islamic metaphysic, basic religious context, kind of a mixed, blended all together, and then with design training, right? So these particularities of my training narrative of basically cumulative witnessing of encounter and holding together creates this unique point of view. That's where voice comes from. But it has to always start with this studying of masters an imitative stance, taking in the model and kind of having almost a one-to-one, a mimetic copy, a mimesis copy of it. But you can't stay there. And typically the reason why is encountering you get bored, you find the limit of it, you see that it doesn't work, either internally or external, or applying it to the external world one way or another. And then through that process of accumulative time, like this is why voice and having developed, cultivating a voice takes a very long time. It's a multi-decade period. I think that's also the big tension part, is that in the training in the arts, there's a kind of silent assumption that to actually cultivate that value proposition, that uniqueness of voice of a one-of-one, is a multi-decade period. It takes about 10 years. Maybe the minimum is 5 to 10 years, probably 10, or probably maybe 5 if you can really compress it down. I find that interesting in terms of, but that's actually not. I think the unspoken and then hope of the educational process is to do that, but it's not spoken out loud in terms of creating a cultivating voice. Because one can make an argument that seems incredibly arbitrary and it seems completely the subject of subjectivity. But that's actually, one would argue, that's the whole purpose of education, is to encounter, like you expose and encountered. And ideally what's happening, you're gathering things of intimacy, you're driven by, and then you're holding them together, and through the interactions of them, you're operating through and creating a unique voice, so that on this operation of the beautiful we're talking about, you get to see things anew. I give it back to you, Javier.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that I think some people say it, but they say it in such a way that it doesn't carry any force or significance to uniqueness. Like, people will say, you go to college so you can think for yourself. They say that. But in some ways, saying that is not the same sentiment as to what we're saying, to find your voice. Because my frustration is, you run into the problem of, well, how do you think for yourself if you're depending on certain things for you to think for yourself? In some ways, that phrasing, think for yourself, is not really adequate, but it's this combining, this meshing of finding your voice that you could say is really closer to the sentiment of thinking for yourself. But yeah, people speak of thinking for yourself as if it could be really independent of things. Oh, if you just look at it objectively, like, this is you thinking for yourself, not following the masses, not, it's very clearly this. It's like, well, there's all sorts of problems with that. But if we look at it like, actually what we're doing is we are depending on history. We are depending on history. We are depending on masters. Actually, as a fun side note, it's still relevant, but actually I had to learn how to juggle this semester and write a research paper on it. Because I had to explain, how does one go through the motor stages of learning? And it's very interesting about how you go from the motor stages of learning to then, because in some sense you are learning from the masters, right? Anybody that teaches you how to juggle is always going to teach you with something incredibly simple. Can you get the ball from this hand to this hand? And can you do it consistently? Then you can start adding in the second ball. But you can never jump to the third ball because the third ball requires you to have already mastered the two previous motor learning stages. And I feel like art, when we talk about art and being in artistic fields and learning from masters, that's the kind of same thing. But then I think, where does juggling tricks come from? It comes from the fact that you mastered a very specific set of a very normal skill. Like, any juggler can do the 3-ball juggle. But once you can do the 3-ball juggle, now it's a question of what can you do, and in how many different ways can you do that 3-ball juggle? And I think that is very similar to what it means to finding your unique voice. And unfortunately, I think people miss out on that part. They simply are satisfied with, okay, I got the account. That's enough. I got the account. It's right. I don't need anything to do with that. Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, education has kind of like failed in terms of, or maybe we could say it hasn't failed, because you could say it's never been the explicit model to do this in. You could say that. But I'm not so sure. I mean, but I still think it should be I think people would be interested in education if they knew that was the explicit thing about what it would mean to find your unique voice in something, rather than, quote, being intellectual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just to build on that, I've actually, because you've been reading Hegel a lot, this feels a lot like freedom of indetermination. Like, you submit to an account,
yeah,
and you gather it together, and then you actually, at the limit of it, you then start play. Yeah. That's actually where your freedom is in that. So, which is actually the thing is, it's you know what it is? It's like, it's an issue of honest actors. Everyone's being like, everyone wants the best, right? Everyone wants the good, but because no one's actually thinking in beauty, they're not realizing the larger step back to see what's actually the purpose of all this. I say this because, listen, professors want the best, but we get caught up in mechanics of teaching the content and then how to build this in a structured way so the class is effective and efficient, etc. Administrators are thinking about how to move through students through a population and get enrollment in and meet requirements of admissions, law requirements, accessibility, etc. Everyone wants the best, but because no one's actually doing the step back to think through, well, what exactly is the end goal of this? Mm-hmm. What is the end goal of this whole encounter with education? It's a very different. If someone we said, what is this for the sake of? Mm. That make all this activity good. It's to say that if we're saying find your voice, and we mean by finding your voice, going through accounts, exploring those, encountering them, integrating it into your personal experience, and then asking questions of how might we integrate statistical analysis with art making, or Hegelian dialectics with learning juggling, for example. Mm-hmm. Like, it seems almost like that tension when I say that, I go, well, why would we do that? That's ridiculous. Like, that looks like nonsense. Mostly because, as we're saying, is the reason why people want, when you think for yourself in that sense of what's objectively, we all admit that's because, well, to the norm, right? Into the, what's the norm account. Mm-hmm. It's basically the opposite. It's basically, don't think, it's not like cultivating your own voice. It's basically looking to the big other of some kind of symbolic order and being told what to think, which is like the opposite. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a interesting kind of counterplay in terms of this idea of and being intimate with accounts and being deeply in love with them. And that's also the key note. You have to have deep love with them. And the thing is, I think about this, and again, it might be because I'm a particular person, my particular temperament. Like, there are definitely things that I absolutely did not enjoy when I went through it the first time, as an undergrad especially, that later in my career, I was like, oh, right, that. And I went to my memory and called it up, and I was like, oh, right. So I really ignored that. I really didn't really take it seriously. Now I do. And now I need to go back and reread it and get a better intimacy of it. I think that's in terms of the relationship with the beautiful versus the true. I think that's absolutely the case. That always that retelling, that retroactive retelling to articulate the find the uniqueness in the particular encounter, even when things fail. And I think through that, I think it's of the relationship with the beautiful and relationship with the true. I think that actually is a very maybe use a heuristical point about it. I got to bounce out. Javi, your last notes on you, and then we're out of here.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I'll just do like an anecdote about the how, you know, if someone doesn't believe that they actually have a unique voice, we do, even from a psychoanalytic view, because from a psychoanalytic view, if you go in analysis, what it is that you actually find yourself saying very particular words. And it's these particular words that you use that you'll find yourself repeating, actually, the further you go through an analysis. One of my favorite terms to say in analysis was on the table. I just want it on the table. And that's something that I found myself repeating constantly in my analysis until we finally kind of got into this interpretive bubble about it. But the main point I'm saying is just that we do have a unique voice to things. The question is discovering and unfolding it in more explicit ways, you could say, or to use Hegelian terms, higher determinations. But yeah, that's it from me.